Hello. We'll begin the talk in 2 minutes. I request you all to come to the front. Greetings. Thank you all for being here. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to this edition of Leadership Lecture Series titled as New India Manthan Leadership Lecture Series. We are all here today to widen the horizons of our knowledge and gain insight from the experience of our speaker, Dr.Arvind Virmani. We're incredibly glad to have Dr. Arvind Virmani with us for the evening. Dr. Arvind Virmani is the chairman of the board at IGRO, the president at the Forum for Strategic Initiative, and the president at Chintan. He graduated from California Institute of Technology with a degree in economics. He received his doctorate in economics from Harvard University. He has served as the executive director at International Monetary Fund, where he represented Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Sri Lanka, and was responsible for approving financial and policy decisions for the organization. He has also served as the chief economic advisor for the Government of India at the Ministry of Finance. He has published over 33 journal articles and multiple books in the area of macroeconomics, growth and finance, international trade and tariff, and international relations. May I now invite Dr. Arvind Virmani on the podium, and I would like to invite the professor to felicitate our guest of the day with a token of gratitude.
Thank you. So I was just talking to Professor. It's probably the third time I've come here to Chennai to give a talk. I think the last one was at the MDI. Oh shoot. Economic Institute, Madras Institute of Economics, right, which is the old institution, sorry. My memory gets a little rusty with age. Okay, as the topic says, I'm going to talk about India in global perspective, and fortunately, I guess it comes here. It's really to give you an idea of the Indian economy, as it says, in a global perspective. So I'm going to start by telling you about the global perspective which has taken a change, a very important change, in 2008, the global financial crisis. And then I'm going to put India in perspective and then focus a little bit more on comparing India with China. So those are basically the three parts of this talk which I'm going to give. Now, for those of you who don't know, I'll just explain. The global financial crisis was a credit bubble which burst. So growth was going down. They pumped up the credit, and it's happens with most credit bubbles that you cannot sustain an underlying decline in growth by just pumping credit into the economy. And beyond a point, the bubble bursts and the whole thing comes apart. So the global financial crisis marked a kind of a divide in the global economy. One of the aspects of this divide, I don't know how many of you have studied economics? None of you. Okay, I'll keep it simpler then. Or finance, economics of finance? Anybody? Okay. So basically, there are two aspects of growth. There's the demand aspect and the supply. And what the world was seeing before the global crisis was there was a lot of demand, partly at the end because of credit. If you put credit into the economy, the demand expands. So much of the growth was actually being led by the supply side, which means investment, productivity, output, right? Now, after the global financial crisis, because the credit bubble burst, all this excess credit is gone, so there's not enough demand. So countries which have demand have an advantage. Okay? So that was one aspect. The second aspect, which is very important and interesting, is globalization and international trade. And basically, before the 2008 crisis, there was a huge increase in globalization as measured by the ratio of global trade to global GDP. Okay? And then the whole thing has reversed. And so these are the two factors which are dividing the post-GFC world, which is what we are going to talk about. Okay? But one of the implications, which one had pointed out at the start in 2010, was that economies which were led by exports and investment, remember the supply side driver, which helped economies like China and Southeast Asia, would no longer be there, and the post-GFC world would favor countries which were domestically driven, okay, like India. So in India, and I was involved on the entire reforms from 91 onwards, we deliberately chose what we call a neutral policy with respect to exports. So even though we knew that ASEAN, Southeast Asia, ASEAN, China, which were the fastest growing economies before 1980, was not the way a large economy like India should go. So we deliberately chose policies which were neutral and therefore more dependent or more driven by domestic demand rather than exports. Okay? So that's the important point in this introduction. Now, I'll start by giving you a picture of the growth frame and how India fits into it. And what you have to do is, if you look at, so you'll often hear this said that India is the fastest growing large economy. Okay? So in this slightly complicated table, I want to show you what that means. Okay? So you'll see so you'll see here all countries and then large economies. Okay? So to give you some idea of what that means, you know, why do we say large economies and not all countries? Okay? So if you look at these three columns here, forget the last one right now. This gives you the growth rates of China and India from 94 to 2001, and then from 2002 to 9 and 2010 to 17. So basically one period before the global two periods before the global crisis and one after it, okay? Because the global financial crisis occurred in 2008. So you see that as you go along, China's growth kind of slows down while India's picks up, okay? So over time, this is what has been happening, and much of it has to do with the 1990s economic reforms. I don't know how many of you're all pretty young here, but you may have heard of it. What is usually called Manmohan Singh's reform, because he was finance minister, but politically, of course, Narasimha Rao, I have always said right from the beginning, did not get enough credit, because really the political backing and political decisions were those of Narasimha Rao. You know, I mean, people like, including myself, who played a technical role somewhere there, but the political guy has to decide, otherwise nothing happens. So here we look at these two periods, and you can see what is happening. India's ranking of growth rates is improving here from an average of from 20 to 10, while China's improves from 7 to 5. This is pre-global financial crisis to post-global financial crisis. So we jump 10 positions here. This is all countries. But if you exclude small countries of less than 50 million or 100 million GDP, which are very tiny island states, etc. There are some very small countries in this number here, which are 9 above us, including China. Then actually we go to second position, okay? So these are in terms of averages, remember. Averages now over an 8-year period here, okay? But if you look at the latest period, if you look at even the last 4 years, which is not given here, India is now the fastest growing large economy, okay? So that is a fact, and just to be clear of some people who may have heard of controversies, this is all based on international data from the World Development Indicators, which is as far as we, you know, that is the best comparative source, and objective and neutral, you know, whatever good, bad, and different. That's the best possible source for comparison. Now here I put this China-India comparison more explicitly. This is just the difference between the growth rates of China and India. So China growth rate minus India growth rate plotted. Of course it goes up and down, and then you have a trend line. Now, and it's very obvious, right? If you look at the trend line, what is happening is China's growth differential with India has gone down, and basically in the last 4 years, as I told you before, the average Indian growth rate is now higher than China's, but it's largely because China's growth rate is coming down, largely. There's a little bit of improvement. India's growth has been fairly averaging between 7 and 7.5 over the last 10, 15 years or so. Again, that's the mota point, as we say, okay? Now, this is to give you an important, this is a thing which many people still don't understand or appreciate. So I always show this in my graphs, even to when I give a talk in Washington, D.C. or somewhere in the last 10 years. A lot of people know that if this is it's the share of world growth of different countries or regions. So you will often hear that China has contributed 30%, which is this line up here, to world growth in the last so many years. Well, actually, it's a purely arithmetical concept. That means if you take the total growth in world GDP, how much of that is China, how much of it is India, how much of EU, etc., USA, etc. So what people don't know is that the second highest contribution for the last 7, 8 years, again post GFC, remember GFC is somewhere here, 2008-9, that's a period. India is now about 15%, is the second highest contribution. The US is the third. It's no longer the top dog or even the second, and EU is this is the third one is the Euro area, which is generally a united zone. So we can look at it as a single because of monetary policy, etc. Is about 6%. Okay, so the key takeaway here is that in terms of, you can call it contribution, contributions to world growth, India is now the second highest contributor to world growth. Just for general knowledge, that doesn't mean it's the second highest driver, or even if China is the driver. Okay? Actually, the US still remains the biggest driver of growth, but that is an econometric concept, that how much, if there's a change in 1% in US GDP growth, how much does the rest of the world benefit? Okay? But in contribution terms, this is it. Okay. Now, if you, now what I'm going to give you is a series of tables which show the pre-GFC crisis and post-GFC situation, because that's very important, because it affects the whole world. In fact, some of these tables I presented at a G20 conference in Amsterdam, because people are concerned with stability of the global system, but it also provides kind of useful comparative information for general knowledge. Okay? So that's why I brought it here for you. So basically, if you look at the last column, this tells you what is the change in growth after the financial crisis from before the crisis. So you can see all the major regions, China, Euro, UK, USA, Japan, there's a decline in growth, right? Negative growth, right? The interesting thing, which when I actually put this graph together, that according to the global data, it's the opposite with India. India is the only exception. Our growth has actually increased after the global financial crisis, which is a very interesting fact. Okay? The details don't matter, except that you may want to note that this China in this averages, it's gone down to something from roughly 10 to 8% on this average basis, which is relevant because a lot of people talk about the Chinese growth rate these days, and we'll come to. Now, trade imbalances, those are one of the imbalances we are concerned about. Again, those of you who read about Trump, etc., you will have heard of trade wars or tariff wars, etc., right? So what's the basis? The basis is in the import-export imbalances. So let me give you an idea here of what the situation is. Again, if you look at these two columns here, first and second, we are talking about, most of the comparison will be like what I told you, the 7-8 years before the crisis and 7-8 years after that. Okay, so let's start with the export growth rate. Again, if you see the difference, virtually everybody, all countries, including India, have seen this decline in growth in rate of exports. Okay. So when people tell you India's export growth rate has gone down, in this respect, India is not unusual. Okay, everybody's has. Perhaps the US's, you can see, has gone down a little less, perhaps, and UK a little less, but everybody's growth rate has gone down. Actually, this is misleading, because if you have a lower growth rate, just the simple difference will be, as you know, probably, you know your math pretty well, right? But still, let's leave it at that for the time being, okay? Then you look at the imbalances, which is what we are concerned with across the world, and we see, okay, what is the trade deficit or the current account deficit? What has happened to that, okay? So export minus imports I have here as a percentage of world exports. So you can see this two regions, China country and Euro region, their export minus import ratio has actually gone up. Why have I got it in red? Because this is creating more imbalance. And the other countries are concerned about it. Okay? They are happy. China is very happy. Euro area is happy. But other countries are concerned. That's why it's an imbalance which can create conflict and problems. Okay? Now, I have two others. This US, I say it's also gone up, but in a negative sense. That's why it's not a concern, because USA has always had a deficit, minus 7.4. That deficit has declined. So that's not a red flag. It's actually a positive in terms of imbalances. Okay? Now, quickly to India, where there is not much change. See, it's all pretty close to zero if you look at it in a global perspective, you know. Okay, another aspect of this is savings investment balance. You know, in the old days, and those of you who may have some smattering of development economics, it used to be said that savings is the driver of growth. So in our history from 1950s to 1970, 80, we were always trying to get more savings. No longer true. The key driver in a globalized world is investment, not savings. Okay? Savings will always come. If there are profitable investment opportunities, the savings will come from all over the world. Doesn't matter whether you have less or more. Okay? But for global institution, if there are too big a gap, that becomes a potential source of trouble, imbalance. Okay? Again, same problem, imbalance. So let's see what's happening. So I've given some, just on the last point, you can see that I've got this GCF is the gross capital formation, which is the investment normally what we call. And you can see the change that most countries, the whole world, plus most of the countries, the investment rate has gone down. Okay? The amount of investment divided by the GDP, which we call the investment rate. Okay? There are two exceptions, China and India. Okay? So in the case of India, that's a good thing because we were at 35, which is more or less okay. So it's gone up. But it's a problem in the case of China because it has one of the highest investment rates in the world. Not one, the highest, and probably the highest in history. Okay? So, so the difference has actually increased between, sorry, the investment rate has gone up further. Now, why is that important? You know, before the global financial crisis, everybody used to say China will have to change its growth model. It invests too much, it consumes too little, it has overemphasis on exports and overemphasis on manufacturing. Now, as far as the deficit is concerned, there is some adjustment, 4.3 minus 2.8 to minus 1.5. So on the face of it, there seems to be an improvement, you know, better, less imbalance in China. But we'll see the detail later. And very briefly, oops, where's India? Yeah. So India is also positive in the sense that our deficit has gone down, 0.5 to 0.4. Okay. Now, ICOR, that's a technical term, but what I am doing here is trying to measure the efficiency of investment. You know, the question is when we say China's investment rate is too high, how do we judge? Well, one way to judge it is the efficiency of that investment. Now, you could do it by profitability rate, very hard to get precise data in China. Many people are saying that the rate of profitability is going down, but it's all mostly guesswork because very hard to get precise data and it's selective. You don't know whether it's what part of the economy, what part is not there, what's the whole. Or you can do what is called total factor productivity, which requires a lot more data. So what I do is I use the ICOR, the so-called incremental capital output ratio, which is shown in this in these two graphs here. Okay. So this is the investment rate, this is the incremental capital output ratio, and this is the investment growth rate. So basically, what we see here is that China's ICOR has jumped tremendously. See this line here, 3.6 to 5.4, which is a 50% increase. This is what I was hinting at earlier when we had that low growth rate. So if you take a percentage increase of the percent, then you get a huge increase in ICOR. Now the interesting thing is, every country, every major region, if you see this red line, all of them have seen an increase in ICOR, suggesting an increase in inefficiency. Okay? Here's the surprise. India is the only country where the ICOR has gone down. So we are doing something right. That's the point. That we seem to have a fairly efficient system of allocating investment, doing investment, despite what we say. I mean, if you have questions, I will talk about our banking system and all that. You must have heard the problems in it. But as per comparative data, India's ICOR has actually gone down. Okay? That is very, very surprising, actually, given this thing. This was another big surprise when I actually calculated the numbers. Okay. Here's another thing again for your general knowledge. You will hear a lot of talk now and for the last so many years and probably for a couple of years on something called deleveraging and credit bubbles, particularly now in China, but it's happened everywhere over the last 4 years. So very quickly, what I have here is total domestic credit as a percentage of GDP. Forget these last 3 columns, just look at these. And these are, because it's a stock, we just take a point, at one particular year, 2000. Stock of debt divided by GDP. So, and then we take some kind of a delta here. What is the change? So here we have ordered by the change in this credit bubble. Deleveraging means that the debt GDP ratio should go down. So a lot of countries have been talking about deleveraging. Okay, US, Euro area, etc. This dangerous bubble which burst, which I mentioned to you earlier. So this is the funny thing that both China and Japan have had re-leveraging. Their debt credit has gone up tremendously since the global financial crisis. One way to look at it is look at the world average, which is an increase of 27%. And say that, okay, countries below it seem to be doing reasonably well in deleveraging. These people are re-leveraging. So Euro area, certain amount of deleveraging relative to world seems to be there. It's not actually deleveraging. The debt GDP ratio has still gone up, but still. Similarly in India, it's gone up, but it's not too bad compared to the other major regions. But US and UK have done the best on this front. Okay. Private consumption. Now here it's very important. If you think in broad macro terms, I mentioned to you there's a demand side, and there are basically 3 or 4 elements of demand, which is investment, private consumption. I've talked to you about investment earlier, private consumption, government expenditure, and net exports. These are the 4 broad drivers of demand in an economy. And on the supply side, you have the usual manufacturing, agriculture, etc. So what is happening on the consumption side? So consumption side, we can see that, again, not just the investment. If you look at the last column in terms of growth rates of just increase in real private consumption, you see all the red marks. That means most of the world, the Euro area, UK, Japan, USA, everywhere, the rate of growth of private consumption has gone down after the financial crisis. And again, you have India as an exception, but China is more or less where it was. So again, that could be one of the reasons why India's efficiency has not declined. Remember the ICOR, okay? And also remember what I said about domestically driven economy. We've never been excessively dependent on the external part. So it's more demand driven, domestically driven. And the main source of domestic demand is private consumption. Okay? That's why the importance of private consumption. Because if you talk about government expenditure, then you get into all the fiscal deficit and all those kind of issues. Oh, sorry, one more point here. Yeah. So, so that is the growth rate which declined everywhere. And then you see it as a ratio of GDP, and this is why I put it here. If you look at comparatively, just go down any of these columns. Let's say the latest one. You can see that the USA and UK have among the highest consumption percentages in the world. The world average is 58. USA is 10% above it, and UK is higher also. So what that means is that both these economies in a way are drivers of the global economy because they have an independent source of consumption in a demand driven world. okay? And that is, in a way, one of the sources of the importance of the USA. You know, in current dollar terms, US is the largest economy, not only largest, but then it also has this, what we call autonomous source of growth, the consumption demand of the economy. And that's why if you ever hear discussions of what is happening in the US economy, they'll always first talk about what's happening to consumers, consumer confidence, consumer demand, etc. Okay. So, right. So, but on the other side, here, look at China. It's a complete outlier, 37%. Okay. Highest investment rate, lowest private consumption rate. Look at the outlier. See the average, 58. Euro is more or less there. India is more or less the average of the world, right? Little less, but that's plus minus is not a thing. So, USA and UK way above. India, Japan, Euro area more or less in the middle. And then right at the bottom, China. That's the biggest source of weakness. This excessive dependence on investment, too little consumption. And I showed you the excess of exports over imports. That's another been a huge driver. We'll see a little, but that has improved a little in the sense that dependence has gone down a bit. Okay. I may have to, yeah, I'm going to skip that because it's a little technical, and I'll skip this also, working age, unless somebody wants to know. Now, I'm going to very briefly, let's see how much time we have. Okay. So, I'm going to try and maybe not go into too much detail. There is something about the Chinese economy and how it functions. If anybody is really interested in detail, I'll take it up in the questions. I want to leave some time for Q&A. But there are 2 or 3 points I want to make. And again, somebody who's interested can, you know, it was a communist economy which was owned 100%. You know, the characteristic of a communist economy is that all the assets are owned by the party. There's no private assets. So till 1978 or 79, just think 100% of the economy was effectively owned by the party. And why I say party and not the state, because in a communist system, the state is just an instrument of the party. The party is supreme. Defense forces, government, they are all subsidiaries of the party. Okay? So what they started doing in the 1980s was to introduce what Long Lerner, there's a very fascinating paper by Lange and Lerner, which talks about market socialism. And the idea was that the ownership would remain with the party, but some of the institutions will become competitive. That means you create an artificial market in which institutions or firms all owned by the party, one owner, but they compete. So you set up a hypothetical system where you try to get some of the efficiencies of a competitive economy. Fascinating idea. I just wanted to mention, you may be interested, that's how the reform started. Okay, initially was just that. You know, we talk. There's a lot earlier was land reform. Land reform basically meant instead of cooperative owning the whole thing, the cooperative continued to own, but the people who held the land could act as competitors with certain amount of freedom. That was the initial thing. Let me tell you a story. It was in sometime in the, I joined the Planning Commission in 87, if I remember correctly. And one of my in the first year or two, we had a visit from the head of that Planning Commission, the equivalent of the Planning Commission. And I was kind of asked, to kind of talk to him and answer his questions. So he asked me this question. First, of course, monetary policy. They had no central bank. That was relatively easy, how to set up a central bank, etc., what is important. Then he asked me, tell me something about the coal market. And I was in a fix, because most people think of a market as, where is the coal market? Some question like that, he said, like saying, can we go to the coal market? Okay? It's like if you want to buy some clothes, you go to the market and shop there. But conceptually, that's not what a market is. So the coal market is not something I could take to him in Delhi and say, here's the coal market, because that will not help him. Just having somebody selling coal is not the issue. What is a market? So it was difficult explaining to him, it's a set of institutions where you have supply coming in, demand coming in, some price gets evolved, etc. That's what a market is in these terms. So that's what they did actually. They liberalized the economy, they kept the assets under their control, and introduced market socialism. Okay? The next stage, which is kind of important for the future, if you ever have to deal with China or discuss it, at some point around 90s or 2000, 90s they'll let in FDI. So FDI played a big role. You know, domestic sector remained under. People were in an illusion that all kinds of private things are happening. Not private at all, I'm sorry to say. The TNVs, which everybody said, oh, China is privatizing. Bunkum. Those were all provincial enterprises. Nothing to do with private in the sense we understand it. You know, Birla, whatever, Reliance, nothing. But what they did in the 2000 was they set up what I call party enterprises. It's just a term. It's basically the state-owned enterprises, what we call public sector units, and these TVEs, which were provincial and urban units, set up subsidiaries where party members, their family, friends were notionally in charge. Okay? And they had a lot of autonomy. I'm not saying they didn't, but they were basically party enterprises, and these guys became party capitalists. To give you one example, which you may have heard of, you heard of Alibaba. Okay? Alibaba joined, Jack Ma joined the Communist Party in 2000. He set up Alibaba in 2005. Okay? He couldn't do it without being party member. Okay. Okay, so just bringing it very quickly together. So what I said, the post-GFC, the shift needed in China, and this is not from exports to domestic orientation, investment to private manufacturing to service. This is something which everybody knew. I attended IMF conference in Beijing in 2006, and we discussed all these things. Not happened. I will just show you what has actually happened in China. Okay? And so what has actually happened, you will see in graphs which are fascinating, and I hope you, the global share of exports is rising despite deglobalization, opposite of what everybody is saying. Investment share rose and is higher than before, opposite. Private consumption share remains low. It hasn't gone down, but it's more or less where it was. It went down, up a little bit. Manufacturing overcapacity in tradables, example metals, huge overcapacity. Service driven by credit bubble. So basically they could not create, you know, developing, I told you market, it's a very difficult concept, okay? It needs players, you know, the sellers and buyers have to act in a certain way. It's very difficult, more difficult in services because again in a communist system they had no such thing as services. They didn't believe in the concept of services. Everything was industry, okay? Because services were seen as exploitation of labor. Another fascinating thing which you don't study Marxism now, which is probably good. You have more time for other things. Okay, here we are, very quickly. So look at this. Let's see, what are the curves here? This blue one, if I remember correctly, is the investment. So you can see the investment rate went down. Again, crisis occurred somewhere here. It went down a little and now it's much higher than before. Okay? Am I getting that right? I should have it. Okay, I can see it from here. Sorry, my eyes are not very good. Yeah, the blue is the investment, what is called gross. Red is the consumption, and green is the X minus M. Okay, those are the three. Remember the three drivers. So you can see the blue, the investment rate is actually rose. They just couldn't liberalize. Everybody was saying they'll liberalize, they'll become a normal economy. No, they moved in the opposite direction, which creates problem for everybody else. Because there's huge excess capacity, it's creating problems for our metals industry, for manufacturing. It drives the whole world because it's globalized. Okay? Consumption. Okay? Consumption, look at it. It didn't go up, it went down. Now they are beginning to realize a little bit how worse it is now. Okay? So they're trying to push it up. Again, same. Here they are now again trying to bring it back to some kind of Chinese normal, not the normal global one. And then this one is the interesting one, export minus imports, where they seem to have made some progress, you know, at least from, if you look at these highs, they're slightly lower than before. So you could say, okay, something has been done on the external front. But here's the punchline. Look at what has happened to globalization. So here is a number I was telling you. This is the trade GDP ratio. See how fantastically it's grown before the global financial crisis. Global financial crisis occurs, and in 2010 I made this that globalization would stop. So I had expected that it will kind of gradually go down. It collapsed, and then it's much lower than, I'm frankly not afraid to admit, than I had thought was going to happen. Okay? And I'd given this in a talk in World Bank and Korea Development Institute. Okay? So here is deglobalization. That's what we mean by deglobalization of trade. Now, this is the punchline. Now look at it. Deglobalization is occurring. This is the share of Chinese exports. These were the largest two exporters in the world, were America and Germany. Okay? China exceeds both of them somewhere around 2008, and then it keeps going up. So here you have deglobalization going on, and here you have China continuing to increase its export share. So what do you think will happen? Trump will rise. There's a reality. It cannot happen without subsidies. It can't happen without all kinds of so-called bad things, which, I mean, bad for others, not for China. Okay, they are happy. The party is happy. And here is the credit bubble. Okay, and just the part to see is, see, this is the investment. It's the same graph which I showed you earlier, investment GDP. But see, it's the bubble which is driving it here now. This is the credit, the debt GDP ratio I showed you. So it's basically, it wasn't here. Okay, for most of the period, it's kind of was normal. Then you have a credit crash, GDP outside, because it's a global thing. But then you pump in a whole bunch of debt, and eventually it plays out. It refuses to work. This is the nature of credit bubbles. You see that the graph has flattened, doesn't work. There are no profitable opportunities. You've exploited, your returns are probably down to zero. That's why your ICORs are crashing. Okay, another graph just to re-emphasize. The blue one is India. The red one is China. So see, the ICOR is shooting up after the crisis. India stabilizes. It's hurt in the the global financial crisis hurt us, definitely. That's why there was a problem here. But then it's stabilized and is on a trend basis is going down. Okay. So I'm going to conclude now and open up for questions with just a few words on the tariff war. Again, for those of you who follow this issue, and those of you who are planning to go to the US should know a little bit about it. I don't know how close you are to graduating. There are estimates now that China's sustainable growth rate could be as low as 4.5, but I put it at 4.5 to 5.5 because I said the party in some ways can't let it go down. So they will find some way, I mean, as the saying goes, by hook or by crook, that it really doesn't go to 4.5, but 5.5 even in the official numbers in my view is possible. Just yesterday, the party Congress has reduced the target for this year to between 6 and 6.5. which would probably suggest that the underlying growth rate is below 6% right now. Secondly, the tariff war. So tariff war has actually two effects. I will just tell you very briefly. See, when a country imposes a tariff, on imports from one country, what will happen is the importers in that country, in a market economy like the US, will look for alternative sources of supply, right? So they are importing some things from China which is cheap. You put a 10% or 25% tariff, they look for alternative sources, right? So this is called trade diversion. So trade diversion basically from our perspective benefits India. Okay, of course there's diversion to many other countries, but it is good for countries like Vietnam and India, because particularly in labor intensive imports we are set up well. But there's a second effect, which again, as I said, one of the few things I think Trump has right. I mean, he may have 90% of his domestic policy and all messed up, but what he understands is the power of uncertainty. So this saying, I will put 10%, I'll put 25%, I'm going to leave it for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, nobody knows what he's going to do, creates huge uncertainty for FDI in China. It creates huge uncertainty for their own producers, for their supply chains, okay? Which means that as long as the uncertainty lasts, and for years afterwards, because people can never be certain again, you know, their assumptions, you see, investment is about the future, because you invest now and you produce for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, right? It's all about the future. So the greater the uncertainty about the future, the less the investment. So what he's done is he's created this uncertainty about China, which again means that some of the investment and supply chains is looking outside, okay? So from all the, I have not personally done any study, but I have come across 6 or 7 of them, and they basically say there are, the most heaviest gainer from this stuff is Vietnam, and India is second or third. In fact, I think we could be first or second if we do some of the reforms which are needed, which we know about, I know about, people know about, but the question is of doing something. Okay, with that, I will finish, and if we have some time, we can take questions.
Anyone want to ask any questions?
Thank you for that fascinating story on China. Just wanted to know what is the effect of the one belt, one road policy and the debt trap which China is perceivably pushing others. How does that play into this whole scene with respect to the Chinese story?
Have a piece of paper, I think. Anyway, I'd like to write down the questions. Anyway, so, or I'll take it one at a time, yeah. So belt and road basically, and yes, how that fits into it.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, yeah. Okay, so if we think of the belt and road, there are, you can think of the economic aspect of it, the diplomatic, and the military, okay? Now, I can talk about all three, but given your question, unless you want me to, and our talk here today, let's focus on the economic part of it first. So what is the economic part? As I mentioned to you, that ICOR actually tells you, right, that there is huge amount of overinvestment and that capacity is not being used, because if it was being used, you would have a higher growth rate and the ICOR would go down. On the other hand, it's going up. So clearly, China has a huge overcapacity in manufacturing and construction. Basically, yeah, I forgot to mention that part of this investment driven is infrastructure investment. So there is now overcapacity even in infrastructure. For example, even real estate, there are some estimates that in many areas up to 40% unutilized apartment complexes there, that high, but let's say 20 to 40, 30 is a reasonable guess. So, so clearly there's a push for investment, construction investment, infrastructure investment outside. What is the pull factor? The pull factor is that if you look at, you know, I was in at the end of my IMF term, when we started to developed this new bank, the so-called BRICS Bank. Again, I'm sure you heard of it, right? So we made a lot of estimates then that there is potentially a huge infrastructure demand which is not being met by the World Bank, the ADB, etc. And therefore, such a BRICS Bank is needed and would be useful. So there were huge estimates of potential infrastructure demand from Asia. So clearly, there is that element. So that's the demand side of it. Now, the key point in terms of all the discussions, I mean, don't want to take too much time, but I can come back to it, is the way to think of it is that in the 1950s and 60s, we developed project appraisal. You know, the best economists in the world came to the Indian Planning Commission and refined these concepts of project appraisal, economic rate of return, social rate of return. I have repeatedly asked all promoters of Belt and Road, can you give me one instance where they have done project appraisal for a project from the host side? And I haven't got even one example of it. In the 17s, 80s, I know we struggled to get the international institutions, and now it's a standard thing. They will not lend unless you can show you have an economic return to repay that loan. I mean, tons of things can go wrong. That's what those economists came and struggled. It's all uncertain. Everything is uncertain. That's not an answer. You still have to appraise. You still have to make a decision. You talk to the old guys in the, like my friend Nitin Desai, and they'll tell you, they stood up and said, this project is not viable because Indira Gandhi or somebody wanted it for political reasons. I have not been able to find a single project appraisal of a Belt and Road project. On the other hand, I can tell you of a personal, my friend in Washington who is a Pakistani and highly favorable to the Chinese. They were all pro-Chinese in those days. I don't know about now after Xinjiang. But he said, he was asked by, again, I won't name, in a Central Asian country to evaluate a project going, transport project going through that Central Asian country from China towards Europe. And he asked me, I cannot think of how it will benefit the host country. This is a close personal friend, so he's talking like, you know, we've talked about everything under the sun, okay? And he's a Pakistani. I've discussed equipment and defense and aircraft with him. So, and he tells me, tell me, what will be the benefits to that country? So, you heard of debt trap, etc., but that's the brief answer. And we can go to the diplomacy and military if you want later, maybe. Yeah.
I have also one question related to China, Germany, and the USA. And as we know, there's a trade war between USA and China. So many Chinese investment is going to Germany to buy German companies and to cooperate with German companies. How do you view this kind of behavior from China?
So my view is in a way determined by what I said about the Chinese economy, and that is that there is really a very small genuine private sector in China. So everything is connected to the party, and that will determine how you know, the US, Germany, and many other countries react. Now, what I actually met Hong Kong-based experts who can read Chinese. I don't read Chinese, so you know, I don't have detailed information. So what he told me, I asked him, you know, I have this hypothesis, do you agree with it? He said yes. So I asked him, what are the sectors in which there's actually a genuine private sector? And he gave me three. He said textiles, food, which probably includes all the food service, food companies, all kinds of things. I don't know exact, I didn't drill down. And the third was kind of education on the internet, you know, kind of e-education was the thing. So I asked him entertainment also, he kind of said yes, but those were the three sectors he named. Now, if you take that as a given, right, then basically everything is connected with the party, and everybody is basically there to enhance the party. And the party, as far as people in US and Germany now see, is going on a plan called 2025, which is to get the technology from everywhere in the world and become the leader in every technology. I'm afraid they are not going to allow it. So we will see increasing restrictions on Chinese companies on high-tech areas in call it democratic rich countries. And actually my forecast is that within 15 years or so, you will see a bipolar technology regime. On one side, there'll be USA, Europe, and probably countries like India. We are down here somewhere, but probably in that camp. And then on this side, China, Russia, and certain other countries. So this is something for those who are concerned about technology, I think should think about, because in some ways, at least mildly, we need to start thinking about it and thinking how to proceed. Now, of course, I had a nice chat with your director, and clearly, I mean, it'd be always good to develop your own, but you cannot develop everything. We are still a poor country, so we have limitation of funds. See, the thing about China, which I forgot to mention, or not forgot because I had to end, see the implication of the party. I said party controls something. If you look at, think of the corporate. See, I'm not talking about small and medium industries. For example, I met a lady who has a CA firm in China. I just met her like last week, okay? So I was asking her the same question. She said, what about me? I'm private. Yes, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the corporates, okay? What we call public limited, private limited, the large sector, not small people, tea stall and professionals in thing. When I say, when I say 90% of the assets are owned or controlled by the party, I'm talking about this large segment, which basically is the economy, which has at least 75% of the profits are controlled. That's the key. It's not the assets, it's the profits. So you can do anything you want with it. You can go and set up a complete network for getting technology from all over the world, okay? In the foreign R&D centers, in companies, you can buy all the companies. It's a party which controls this, not private people who decide, oh, I can make some profit by investing in X and Y. That is my model of the Chinese economy. And certain things follow from that, okay? It's just connected directly to it. It's not a, I mean, so to undermine my reasoning, you have to undermine the model. You have to say, no, this model is wrong. Yeah.
How did China manage to have this growth without any of its banks going bust, really?
Yeah.
Where did the money come from?
So there are two important things, you know, for those of us, for older people like us, who knew the Soviet Union. One thing never forget is that unlike the Marxist-Leninist Stalin USSR, which was a centrally planned and controlled economy, the Maoist economy was highly decentralized, okay? He controlled it through ideology, okay? That's why these recurrent, what do you call it, what was that, it's gone out of my memory, the, not programs, they are not like the Russia, it's this thing where all the intellectuals were sent to the countryside, etc. What they call it, I've forgotten. Anyway, there's a term for it. Maybe you remember. Huh?
The cultural revolution?
Cultural revolution, that's right. It's the idea, it's controlled through ideology. So they had a very decent, you youngsters may not remember, Mao wanted to produce steel in the villages. That is how his decentralized thinking was. When we know that steel is one of those things, has to be large scale, economies of scale, okay? He even tried to do that in a decentralized way. So this decentralization and ideological control was his passion. That's what's the thing about. So people, when I used to present this stuff, 10, 15 years ago, they say, oh, but they are not centralized. No, they are not centralized. There's a Maoist model. It's all the market socialism is decentralized. It's the ownership. And the day-to-day management is all decentralized. So how do you grow? You grow because of productivity. And what is the change? You might ask me, so for 30 years they grew at 10%. Now I'm saying their growth rate is 5.5%. Why? Because there is something called a technology frontier. Okay? So when you are far away from the frontier, the technology embodied in investment is enough. You move very rapidly, but beyond a certain point, they used to call it the middle income trap. That's just a fancy word. You've got to start innovating. Okay? There's no such absolute trap, but it's a concept. It's like there's a point beyond which you cannot grow just through investment. That has run out. Okay? Like I told you, 45% is unthinkable. As far as I know, there's no other country in history which has had this high rate. You could use those to grow as long as it was all a matter of investment, no longer. Investment in industry, in manufacturing, very specific. You know what happened in the Soviet Union? They invested heavily, but not even 45, but let's call it heavily for that period. What happened? They produced things nobody would buy. The Chinese Communist Party knew this Deng Xiaoping's contribution. He knew that you have to produce things for people to buy. That is why this export-led growth. You see, what is it that we can produce which these fellows are buying? If it's footwear, there's a huge market. Everything, 90% of footwear market is now Chinese. Toys, look at the toy. Okay, we will invest in toys, and 90% of the toys market is with China. It was all, you could do that. But beyond a point, you can't do it, because after a while, this 50% of the economy is services. Okay? If you look at the, in US, it's like approaching 60, 70. Okay, but beyond a point, there's this whole service sector which cannot be treated like that. It's not a matter of just investing and exporting to somebody else. Okay? Did I answer your question? No. Bubble, credit.
No, banks.
Oh, sorry, banks.
Bank going bust.
Say that again?
You see,
why have they not bust?
When you create infrastructure and assets which don't get consumed or paid back, the bank should go bust.
The other concept of the communist economy was the commanding heights of the economy. One of the key factor in that is control of finance and assets. Earlier I told you 100% of the assets were owned. What are the banks? The banks has these savings of these corporations. People used to say they have a very high saving rate. It is not just households. It is all these companies. They put everything into the bank and then reinvest 90% of it. They're all coming from the party's orders. What are the orders? Grow. The one single objective of the Communist Party was now everything is confused for various reasons, was grow. Grow. How do you grow? You find a product which you can sell, invest and grow. Doesn't matter if there's no profit or something, the financial system will support you. While this export goodie lasted, I forgot to point out that they rode it up that. You remember that globalization curve? Very skillfully. I'm not demeaning anything the Chinese did. It's just what are the lessons for everybody else. They rode that thing. They saw this globalization. They pushed exports. So they produced whatever could be exported. Big difference from the USSR, which just produced and failed. That's what the phase they are in now. They have still got all this investment. There's nobody to buy it. So how do they fail? They control the banks. There's no such thing as a bank failure unless the party says, okay, fail. The savings, whether they are from the corporate sector, which is basically party controlled, or their household, you don't fail. That's a public institution. It's an institution of the party. No bank in India will fail if government wants to put the money in. We have ourselves set up rules to mimic the private sector. We say it must have a capital adequacy ratio of whatever 15%. You don't have to. You don't know what their capital adequacy is. Could be zero, could be negative. Why should there be a failure? In a market economy, when people say the bank is insecure because it's private, it could go down, so you withdraw your savings. Okay, and it fails. Cannot happen in China. They don't even know, and it's fully protected. That's the reason. They can't fail because the party is behind it. And all information is controllable. Yeah.
So I still have one question. So China is trying to rebuild the Silk Road. So from China to across Russia and then across Middle East and then to go to Europe. So for this project, the Chinese government has to invest a lot of money in this project. But I want to know why the government don't want to invest in domestic market, because I think Chinese market needs private consumption to grow.
So you're asking why Chinese government doesn't want to invest in domestic consumption?
Invest a lot in Silk Road instead of domestic consumption.
Good question. So if you look at the reforms which were needed, I forget where it was. It's not. I thought, see. So what was needed to private consumption? Did I mention it here? Yeah, investment to private consumption. So if we look at the history of the wage rate, you will find, if you do a simple graph, for a graph where on the bottom line you have per capita GDP, and over here you have the wage rate, you'll generally find in market economies it goes simultaneously. As your per capita growth rises, your wages rise. Okay? And if you look at the same plot in China, you will find it's way below. So the wages were actually controlled to promote labor-intensive manufacturing and export. Okay? So from 2010 or so, there was a period of 2-3 years where wages were liberalized, and they increased by something like 20-30%. Okay? So that was the good part, where as you increase the wages, that's the only realistic way in my view of, allow the wages to reach their natural level instead of controlling them. That will increase consumption and demand. The second factor in globally is the savings of the people. Whatever little, there are obviously savings of Chinese household if you give them the market rate of interest. Okay? So here's your second part, which also relates to your question. There's a huge gap between the interest rate given to the savers and rather the other way around, that it's kept very low, so you can give the credit at low rates. Okay? So both those things are now back to the old thing. The wages are again controlled. Why? Okay, you might ask, why don't you do when everybody agrees, including Chinese economists? I met in 2006 in Beijing. They all agree. There's no disagreement. Why then? Why is that when you keep postponing these things, it becomes a dilemma. Because if you suddenly allow wages to rise, all your labor-intensive goods are going to become uncompetitive. They are already uncompetitive. India's wage rate is now 20% of China's. Not surprisingly, because your per capita income is whatever, three times India's, right? So, so they are in a dilemma, because once you let the thing loose, it becomes the party is afraid of losing control. That's simple answer. I'm afraid it's all about the party. It's the judgment of the party. Yeah.
Sir, I'm Amar Jyoti. I'm doing PhD here in economics. My question is, I'd request you to highlight the monetary policy aspect of China, how they manages to keep the interest rate low in a global economy with financial contagion and the exchange rate pressure. We have seen that they have a huge forex exchange, but then how they tackle the monetary policy.
Yeah. So the best way to explain it is again by a practical example, and then one can do the theory. It doesn't matter. See, after the global financial crisis, every country expanded monetary supply, and some countries also expanded fiscally. We did that too. Now, what the Chinese, one of the things which happened because of the exports, I told you that huge decline, because you remember that little bump down, huge bump down actually. Because the Chinese economy at that time was so export dependent, they suffered hugely from the fall in exports, which nothing got out. And the only way they could counter is to inject huge amounts of credit into the economy. So you could say, okay, at that point it was justified, but this continued till 2015. So from 2008 when the crisis occurred, from 2009 everybody is pumping up, but they continue for 6 years. Given the history of financial bubbles, it was predictable. There are now books written on this because of the global financial crisis. So China is not different in that way. That bubble has to burst. So I said that the bubble will probably burst in 5 to 7 years. I said this at the IMF. Because it's all uncertain. It's all probabilistic. There is no particular thing you can say for sure, anything. So what happened? What happened was it began to burst in 2015. People started taking their money out. The Chinese, the foreigners, etc. There was a foreign exchange crisis and they clamped down heavily. They cut down the money. So it's basically imposed capital controls. So the narrative earlier was yuan or RMB is going to become globalized, which means you are free to go in and out. And then you have the crisis and there's now complete capital controls. Okay? It's something we call the trilemma. You're familiar with that, right?
Yes, sir.
Right. So they handle that situation by reimposing controls. Now they are very, very strict controls. The last I heard a couple of months ago, they are saying certain types of things we'll put you in jail if you do this. Not just fines. They're saying we'll actually put you in jail if you do this. So very strict capital controls.
Thank you, sir. Sir, one more question. You talked about party enterprises. As you said that all the large corporates are mostly the party enterprises. Why don't they fail? Because we saw in Indian case the public service undertakings which we have faced a lot of problems because of why we went ahead with privatization or disinvestment. Why those kinds of problems are not faced by party enterprises in China?
Sorry, just the last part, because interest rates are not free. Remember, the interest rates I told you is kept down both for savers and the thing. So the monetary policy can't have any effect because monetary policy works through interest rates. If interest rates are controlled, it all has to balance in credit, right? So it's rationing. If you, in a market economy, if you, let's say the interest rate is here, if you hold interest rate down here, that means there's excess demand for credit. That means it's all a matter of rationing. And what did the rationing do? It gave it to exactly the kind of companies you're saying. The rationing is that any SOE, which is fulfilling the party's purpose, or any private individual, for example, if there's a so-called private company which is in construction, Chairman Z had said, go out and belt the road. They are all out there. It's an order. You don't have to order. That's what you have to understand about Mao, that ideological control. It's all that heritage of Maoism. So, and then they say, okay, we did this. You wanted us to go to, I don't know where, let's, build this thing to Europe. We have done it. How they did it, we can go into detail if, the gentleman has, you're still there. Okay, I can go into the detail of that. But, we don't have enough money. Well, you get credit. You keep getting credit till the cows come home. I mean, you keep surviving as long as the boss is happy. Boss, I don't mean he individually deals with all this, but that's really the legacy of Mao. I mean, you don't have to make orders all the time. You don't have to give directives. There's ZS said it. Every underling is trying to say, okay, how to implement it. He doesn't have to say anything again, because all their promotions, all their everything depends on it. And if you get obstreperous, there's always the corruption. Very easy, because everybody is corrupt. You could say like India, but it's a different. Okay. Okay, yeah, I think we've done enough. I think people must be getting that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for the informative lecture, sir. It was a great learning experience. Thank you all for gracing this event with your presence. Thank you.